it's Mo. If you're coming here from the last video that I made, welcome to part 2 of my March reading wrap-up. So every month I do vlog-style monthly reading wrap-ups where I talk about the books that I've read in the month as close to when I've read them as I can. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book to not make these wrap-ups super long. I tell you something about the book, whether I recommend them, if I like them, my thoughts on these books. This video is going to be my part 2 of my March vlog style reading wrap up because I read 28 books in March, which is a lot of books. As I was editing, this video was getting way too long, so I decided to divide it up into 2 parts. So if you want to see the books that I read in the beginning of the March, go back to that video and I will have it linked down below. I'll go through real quick the books that I covered in that video. I read The Oxford Brotherhood by Guillermo Martinez. I read The Amazing Mrs. Polifex by Dorothy Gilman. I read Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. I read The Man in Lower 10 by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. The Doll's House by Lisa Unger. Sula by Toni Morrison, which was a reread. Fires to Come by Asha Lemme. No One Can Know by Kate Alice Marshall. Staged by Elle Casimano. My TBR spin book for January, which was Black and Buddhist, which is a collection of essays. Lady Takes the Case by Eliza Casey, Undercover by Tamsin Muir, I really like that one, and The Appeal by Janice Hallett. So if you want to go over and see my thoughts on those, definitely feel free to check out that video. I will tell you that one book in that video I really disliked. Now let's talk about all the other books that I read in March. The next book that I read in March was The Fall Risk by Abby Jimenez. I think this is the 3rd Abby Jimenez I've read, one of which was also a short story, and this takes place in the same universe as that short story. So we are introduced to 2 people who live in an apartment building and they wake up on their landing. There's like 2 apartments per landing and the stairs are gone. So they have never met before. They meet and they call their landlord or the super of their building and say like, hey, we have no stairs, we have no way to get down out of our house. And the super comes, who we've met before in a previous story, and he says, oh, they messed up, they took the wrong staircase out, like no one's going to be able to come till after the weekend. So we spend the weekend with our 2 main characters who meet for the first time, become friends, and obviously because it's a romance, fall in love. And then there's a lot of other stuff going on in each of their lives. The hero has recently gotten divorced and the heroine has a past of being stalked. So there's definitely some heavy topics like in all of Abby Jimenez's stories, and there's definitely some serious and intense moments, but there's also some like feet kicking and giggling about the relationship between these 2 people. I have read 1 full-length novel of Abby Jimenez and 1 short story prior to reading this, and I think I like her short stories better. I did enjoy Part of Your World, which was the full-length novel, and I was going to read Yours Truly, which is a sequel to that, but I actually unhauled that recently because I decided that I just wasn't that interested. I think if I'm going to continue to read Abby Jimenez, I will continue to read her short stories. That being said, I do think there were aspects of this short story that were kind of glossed over or told in a little bit of a flippant way or flippant seeming way because it was a short story. So you have to like take those aspects with a grain of salt. There is extremely heavy topics of someone being stalked and someone being potentially assaulted or murdered by that stalker, and then there's kind of an end resolve to that aspect of the story that like kind of almost is like done in a dangerous way, but you have to balance that out with the idea of it being a short story. So like you're not able to get into a longer, bigger explanation, more carefully treaded explanation or outcome of that part of the story. So I did like this one. It was sweet and cute. The next short story that I read in March was Stockholm by Catherine Steadman. So now I only have 1 more Catherine Steadman to read, which was the novel that came out last year. I've read everything that I could read from Catherine Steadman up until that one, and Catherine Steadman is definitely one of my favorite thriller authors. She is a British author, and generally she writes about British women who are displaced somewhere in the world, usually in America. Stockholm is about a young American woman who was previously a therapist. As we meet her, she is being taken on vacation by her husband. As we see her going on this vacation with her husband, we learn about her and her husband's relationship, which has turned extremely dangerous and abusive over time. So we learn her backstory through her trying to escape her husband now. And this was very thrilling. This was a very short story. I think it was only, a little over an hour. It's a very thrilling short story, and it's a very dark short story for these short story collections. So usually in these short story collections, there can be dark elements, but there's some kind of glimmer, a happy ending, or hope, or something. I feel like this story didn't really have that. So definitely be prepared. A lot of violence, a lot of graphic depictions of SA and marital rape. I mean, not graphic depictions on page, but like implied graphic elements and violence and abuse, all sorts of stuff. But I did enjoy this one. As opposed to Abby Jimenez, I think I prefer Catherine Steadman's full-length novels. The next book that I read in March is Dusk or Dark or Dawn or Day by Shauna McGuire. This was written in, I think, like the late 20-teens, 2017, and it is about a young girl in 1972 who finds out that her sister is dead, and she kind of runs away from home and actually is killed herself in an accident. So then we see her later in her afterlife in New York, and she's working at a suicide hotline, and she is dealing with being a ghost and when her final time to leave this earth is going to be. So we learn all about kind of ghostiness and other supernatural or paranormal elements that exist in the world that we as regular humans are not aware of. Our main character has to go on a journey to find her dying day and be reunited with her sister. And of course, there's a little bit of a mystery element, and there's a little bit of a thrilling element, and we meet more characters and more ghosts who could potentially come back in other books. And we just see like kind of a new take on like a ghostly universe. So this one was pretty quick and fairly interesting, but not a lot of meat necessarily to this short novella. If you are a fan of Shauna McGuire's The Wayward Children series, which I am, I think this has some similar elements: queerness, found family, adventure, the other side of our world. So like a different look, or a look behind the veil of the world that we currently live in. So if you like books that take place in our universe but are a little bit different, this one is worth checking out. If you like the Wayward Children series, and if you want a different take from Shauna McGuire on an idea of an existing parallel universe within our universe, then I think this one's worth checking out. Very quick, easy to read, some cute moments, some thrilling moments. I enjoyed it just fine. The next book that I read in March was Cruel Work, which is another of those short stories, and this one is by Justin Torres. So I have read 2 Justin Torres books so far, one which was like autofiction vignettes, and the other one, which was Blackouts, which was his National Book Award winning, I think, book that came out last year or 2 years ago, maybe. I think it came out in 2024. So Cruel Work is a short story about a young man who is just kind of trying to get through life. He is queer, and he sometimes has boyfriends or people that he stays with, but he sometimes has sex with different people for money or for advantage, and this is just kind of his life tale, or a portion of his life tale as he goes through life, making friends, losing friends, having sex with different people, caring about people, not caring about people, learning about himself or denying things about himself. I think something of note in this story is that the very beginning of this story is included in Blackouts in another way. So I feel like this is probably a true piece of autofiction, at least that very little bit about a former boyfriend. It is expanded in Blackouts, so while it's word for word, it's a very short portion, and maybe it was the part of the inspiration for Blackouts, maybe it was just a story that Justin can tell in various areas of his life and his writing. So I enjoyed it. It definitely has sex and a little bit of violence, depression, drug use, but it was basically a slice of life. And I would read more Justin Torres pretty much always. I think he does have some collection of poetry that I would definitely love to get my hands on. The next the next short story that I read in March was Boca Raton by Lauren Groff. This is the second Lauren Groff that I've read. I also read her collection of short stories, Florida. Boca Raton. No recollection of what this was about, but I do remember liking it. Let's see. The description says, a mother's latent fears rise as relentlessly as the Florida seas in the startling story of a planet and an imagination under pressure. Yeah, so I don't remember this one basically at all. Our main character is super fearful of climate change and falls into thought spirals and depression and anxiety around her daughter growing up and her life in Florida. Oh, and I do remember that she is always trying to help people. Our main character is often getting into situations that aren't necessarily that beneficial to her because she is willing to do things for others. If someone she's associated with has a house that they need to get rid of, and she ends up buying this house very cheap. So it is a place for her and her daughter to live, but it is not necessarily the best decision. And this all is about her increasing anxiety and depression about climate change, about the future, but also this is all exacerbated by her not being able to sleep for days and days. So this story does kind of decline into a fever dream of reality, unreality, where we are not sure exactly what she is seeing and what she is imagining due to her state of exhaustion. Obviously not super memorable, but I really like this one. I think partly I get it mixed up because I've read Weather by Jenny Awful, and that follows some of the same themes in kind of a similar cadence or structure as Boca Raton. So like I might be confusing those a little in my mind, which is why it was hard for me to recall Boca Raton immediately. The next book that I read in March was At Bertram's Hotel by Agatha Christie. It is still March Mystery Madness, one of my all-time favorite readathons, and I try to always read a Christie or two every year, but definitely I try to read one around March Mystery Madness. This is the 9th or 10th book in the Miss Marple series. I'm working my way through the Miss Marple series before I read any other Agatha Christie. That's not true. I'm also reading the Tommy and Tuppence series, but I'm reading that one much more slowly. And also Tommy and Tuppence only has like 4 books total, so it's not hard to read these two series together. In our last installment, Miss Marple went to the Caribbean, which was a gift from one of her nephews, and of course she solves a crime on a Caribbean island. In this installment, that same nephew gifts her a getaway, another getaway of some variety, and she decides that she really wants to go to Bertram's Hotel, which she went to as a young girl. It's a hotel in London, and she gets there. She is pleasantly and unpleasantly surprised that Bertram's Hotel hasn't changed that much since her youth. So she spends her time in the hotel in a leisurely manner, or going shopping, window shopping, or shopping around London, seeing friends, or running into acquaintances. Of course, there is a mystery that happens, and of course, a inspector is called out. We meet this new police inspector who is nicknamed Father, as he's called out to Bertram's Hotel to look for a missing clergyman. Of course, Miss Marple has observed and knows more than just about anyone, including the detective, and of course the detective enlists Miss Marple's help to solve this crime. So I really like this one. It had kind of a shocking ending that I was surprised about. I liked that Miss Marple was involved in this, that she's seeing everything firsthand, because sometimes she does use proxies basically to solve the murder. She knows something about the events, and then she sends someone in to kind of find all the clues, and then she deduces the resolution. But in this one, she's there on her own. She's not a huge part of the story, but she comes in and out with the different characters in this story, and then when our police inspector discovers that, of course, she's going to know something about this and utilize her in this case, we see more of Miss Marple. So I really love Miss Marple books for those aspects, that the stories change, and that although she is our main character in many respects, she is also not our main character in many respects. Those are more books that I have read, and when I read some more, I will let you know. Hi, I'm sick. It is March 27th, and I have read a few more books in March. The next book that I read in March was The Garden by Tomi Adeyemi. Tomi Adeyemi is a young adult novelist, I believe, and this is a very short story. This one is about a young woman who finds her mother's diary, and that diary leads her to go to South America, I believe it was Argentina, to discover something that she has read about in her mother's diary. So she goes down there without speaking Spanish, without knowing exactly what to expect. All she really has to hold on to is her mother's diary. Her mother has passed away, so she can't ask her any questions or anything like that, or we think her mother has passed away. And she meets a guide who helps her, takes her into this jungle area where she is looking for this thing. I guess it's kind of a coming of age story where our main character is doing something on her own and doing something that might be against other people's better judgment, but she is adamant that she is going to follow this trail that her mother has left her. So it was interesting. It was like pretty, and there's a little tiny bit of like a romantic element, but on the whole, I think it was like mostly forgettable. I would read something else by this author if they did some adult books maybe, or other short stories. One of the things that I find about these short stories is that some of them are amazing, and when they are amazing, I would definitely read more short stories by that author. Some of them are good, and I would definitely read more short stories by that author. Some of them are fantastic, and I want to read full-length novels by that author. And then every once in a while, there's a dud. The next book that I read oh my god, I hurt my thumb too. The next book that I read in March was The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. This book was nominated for the Women's Prize quite a few years ago, I think in the early 2000s. Actually, when was this book written? Oh no, this book was written in 1997, so in the 90s, this was on the women's long list. That is not the reason that I picked it up. I've wanted to read this one for a while. It sounds really interesting. It's about a young, widowed woman who tries to make her home in a small British town. And one of the things that she tries to do in that town is open a bookshop. Unfortunately, over the 10 years that the woman spends in this small town, she is not accepted, she is not loved, she is not encouraged, and this is the story of kind of her dealing with that adversity, just the idea of that cloistered nature of small communities and how sometimes to their own detriment they'll allow their prejudice or their insular nature to not only not accept people, but like also to the not accept people to the detriment of their town, if that makes sense. I also read this for Books and Lala's Buzz Coverathon. Gosh, the light is just brutal right now. Which was a book with books on the cover, or a book on the cover. I read this one on audio, and the audio cover is even more so bookish. The next story that I read was another short story, and it was Ungirls by Lauren Bukes. This is the first Lauren Bukes that I've read. I am interested in one of the ones that she wrote that's like a coming of age of multiple girls, and they're like gross and mean, and it's set in Florida. I don't remember what that book is called, but I can see a theme in some of her works, and it is going to be coming of age girls stories, and it is going to be a little bit of grossness, because in Ungirls we are following several people who are mostly sex workers of one variety or another, but this is at a time when kind of incels and misogynistic young men and society have created these, I forget what they're called. They're not called Ungirls, but they're like basically like 3D printed meat sack sex objects. So you can go and you can buy this headless sex doll who has just enough mobility and everything to do the acts that you might want them to perform, but they don't come with any kind of like real personality or any kind of human aspects other than those that you like kind of imbue with your mind. So obviously the misogynistic people are into this. The world at large is like feeling okay with this because they're not real people, and because they don't have heads, you don't have to pretend that they're real people, so you don't have to give them any sort of respect or rights or anything like that. This is a multimedia story, so there's little snippets of chat rooms, there's little snippets of news articles, there's little snippets of gossip where people say that they've eaten these sex bot creature things because they are like made out of human flesh, but they're just not made human. The story mostly follows one person who has lent her voice to these faceless, headless sex bots, except they're not robots, they're like organic sex creatures, and the repercussions of that. She is also a sex worker. So it's an interesting look at the idea of like dehumanizing sex work, dehumanizing women, dehumanizing queer people, the validity, like the necessity, or not necessity, but the what's the word? Like the common use of sex work, but the looking down on sex workers. It was interesting. I don't think that the multimedia aspect and the mixed media aspect really worked for this particular audiobook. I don't know if that was because of the reader. I don't know if that was because of the media involved. I don't know if it was because of the story. But like, for instance, Treasure, which I read by O'Kane Braithwaite, which was another one of these short stories, had some mixed media, and that I think worked a lot better, and it had some similar themes of like internet fame and stalking, and that really only used like Instagram, so it was a little bit easier to understand on audio. That one is one of these short stories that I would highly recommend. It's one of my favorite ones that I've read of these so far. I read it like 2 or 3 years ago. But so this one was interesting. I don't know if it actually like worked for what it was. I would like to have seen this one physically to be able to see, or I guess digitally, to be able to see what the mixed media sections look like. But if those themes interest you, I think it's worth picking up at like an hour and 15 minutes on audio. The next book that I finished in March is Sarah Grand's Claire DeWitt and the Infinite Blacktop. So it's not called Claire DeWitt and the Infinite Blacktop. This book came out like 10 years, well, like 5 years, well, like 6, wait. Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead, which is the first in the series, came out in 2011. The next book came out in 2013. And then this one came out 5 years later in 2018. So I think that they were just kind of trying to market this as like a standalone, which it is not. You absolutely need to read the other books to understand what's going on in this one. You can read it on its own, and it does sort of make a novel, but it starts immediately where Claire DeWitt and the Bohemian Highway leaves off, like the next second from that book. And then there's a lot of confusing part that isn't really explained to you because you should have read those first 2 novels first. I reread The City of the Dead 2 years ago, 2023, which I can't believe. I thought I had read that in 2024, but I read it in 2023. And then I just read the second in the series last month, and now I've completed this third in the series. Sarah Gran is putting out a short story collection with short stories revolving around Claire DeWitt soon this year, so I'm super, super excited about that. This does not have a definitive ending. So that, I don't think that's spoilers necessarily, because none, well, maybe the first book kind of does. You could definitely read all of them for their mysteries. I should probably tell you what this is about. Claire DeWitt is the best detective in the world. She is a holistic detective, and she was trained in the Saletian School, which is this very obscure detective school based on this one book by this one guy. And there are very few of these detectives left, but they kind of stick together. And as Claire DeWitt is growing up and as she is discovering herself as a detective, she meets her mentor, Candace, and Candace mentors her to be the best detective in the world. Unfortunately, we find out in the first book, which again, I don't think this is spoilers because it happens right away, that Candace is no longer with us and Claire DeWitt is on her own navigating cases and dealing with mysteries on her own. Sometimes she has help from other people, and when we meet her in Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead, she is called back to New Orleans where she lived with Candace to deal with some cases. Because she is a holistic detective, it's never like straightforward things, and sometimes the mysteries don't end when the case is solved. Sometimes the mysteries don't end when the perpetrator, the murderer, is found. Sometimes the toll that each mystery and each case takes on Claire DeWitt is like more than she can handle, and we see that in the third book very much so. But this book ties in with mysteries that we have seen in other books, as well as mysteries that have come up in Claire's life that we've learned about in other books. So each book has a mystery in it, a fairly contained mystery in it, at least one, that you could solve. They're kind of told in various parts, in various timelines. So Claire might be working on several cases at once. Usually there's some sort of connection either within herself or within the cases that kind of makes sense over time. Sometimes not so much. So each book you could read for those mysteries alone, but you're not going to get as much out of the stories unless you read the entire series all at once. So when I say that this book does not have a conclusive ending, I just mean that there are more mysteries and more connections that Claire DeWitt is obviously going to have to go on and discover. It's satisfying. Things are revealed, things are completed, but it's unsatisfying in that now it's been another 8 years since we've had a Claire DeWitt book. So I am looking forward to seeing that short story collection and seeing if we get some answers in that from some questions that are posed in this book. Also, I was happy to reread this because the first time I read it, I hadn't read Claire DeWitt since 2013, so I hadn't read it since the second book came out, so I was a little bit confused going into this one. I didn't remember everything that happened, but going so quickly into this one, it was nice to see the continuation of the things that continue and the resolve of the things that don't continue. Definitely highly recommend the series. This is one of those series that like I just love. It's exactly my right catnip. It's not for everyone, but I really enjoy it, and I look forward to reading more, and I hope there are more in that series eventually. The next book that I finished in March, which I finished this morning, is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This was also on the Women's Prize, I think in 2022. This is a story set during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So the first forward part takes place in 2015, which is in the future, and then we step back into the 80s or 90s, and we meet Kushla, who works part-time at her family's bar. Her family has owned this bar in Northern Ireland. They are Catholic, and she is also a teacher at the local school. So the Troubles are the conflict between Catholics and Protestants to kind of dumb it way down and make it a very simplified version of what the Troubles are in Ireland. I don't know a ton about the Troubles. This is the first novel that I've ever read set during the Troubles, which I think was really interesting. It definitely made me want to read more set in this period, and then also more about this period. I would love to read a nonfiction about the Troubles. I think Patrick Radden Keefe has one that everybody really, really likes, so I will definitely be keeping my eye out for more nonfiction about this subject as well. Kushla is working at the bar. Her brother now owns the bar. Her father had it. She's dealing with having two jobs. She's dealing with the conflict that's going on. She's dealing with there being a lot of militant activity in her area, both military with cops and soldiers and people coming in and kind of abusing the power of that, and then also she's dealing with people retaliating violence that is happening. In lots of the chapters we see Kushla listening to her mother listening to the radio, and we hear about all the horrible things that have happened that day, car bombings or murders or beatings. And when one of the families from Kushla's school, one of the young boys that Kushla teaches father is severely beaten and left for dead, Kushla kind of takes it on herself to take this family under her wing and help this family out as much as she possibly can. She's also dealing with her mother, who, since her father has died, has become a severe alcoholic, and she has trouble kind of doing anything or getting anything done. And then Kushla meets a man who is a Protestant, who is a barrister. They form a relationship. That is all I will tell you about that, because it's not like a really big story. It's kind of a small story. It's kind of just about this period in Kushla's life, meeting this person, falling in love with this person, dealing with day-to-day life in this like extremely violent and dangerous time period, and just all the normal things that people have to deal with, and how those normal things are made almost impossible by war, by destruction. So it's interesting. I enjoyed it. I think the writing is really pretty. People might struggle because it doesn't have quotation marks. I read this one on audio, so I didn't even realize that until I was a little bit of the way in, and then I picked it up and I was like, oh, it doesn't have quotation marks. I've read books without quotation marks before, and they don't really bother me, but I know that sometimes people love that, sometimes people hate that. I did think that the story dragged for me a little bit in the middle, and that was kind of the time that there was more like sex and there was more talk about like the relationship, and that just wasn't as interesting to me to be like drawn out quite as much. Whereas I think there were some things that were like very much not glossed over, but like almost said like as an aside, that were traumatizing or important or had an effect on Kushla. Whereas her having sex with this guy was like talked about a lot, which I was like, okay, like I get it, you're establishing their relationship, but it just wasn't as interesting to me. But then the ending, which I feel like books like this sometimes are like that, the very ending really caught my attention. And of course there is events that happen that kind of brought everything together. All the threads of Kushla's life collide at the end of this book, and you have to watch her go through the consequences of those different threads. So in the end, I really did enjoy it. It made me cry at the end. I thought it was really sad. I'm glad to have read it. I definitely read this for Irish History Month, and like I said, the majority of the thing that I liked about it was learning about the Troubles, having a story that was set during the Troubles, and then hopefully I will learn more about that time period in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st. I have 5 more days, so I might see you in there, or I might see you at the end. It is well into April, and that means it's time to do my wrap-up of the wrap-up. So the next book that I finished in March was Trapline by Timothy Zahn. This is a short story, and it is about a future time where people can project their bodies into other organic components of bodies, so clones, in different places all around, but specifically our main character is projecting his consciousness into a clone that is basically just a body with no inhabitant that is in a space station far, far away. He's done this a couple of times before, but it's still risky business, and he's kind of talking to his superior about it. They're like, oh, it's no big deal, but you're like one of the only people who can do this. So that reminded me a little of The Space Between Worlds. And then of course for this mission that our main character is a little trepidatious about, something goes wrong. The majority of this short story is about how he gets his way out of this problem that he finds himself in. So it was really interesting. I liked it. I didn't think it was like amazing, and like I said, it definitely reminded me of other things. Like it felt to me like a Star Trek original series episode, which is not a bad thing by any means, of course, but it wasn't like blow me away amazing. This was the first Timothy Zahn that I've read, and that's why I love these short stories, because I get to test out some authors that I've never read before and find stories that I either really, really love or that I just think are okay. I thought Trapline was fun, and if you're interested in sci-fi, I would definitely suggest checking it out. It's like 40 minutes. The next book that I finished in March was What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is my first T. Kingfisher. I actually found this book in a little free library not too long ago, I think in March, and I was so excited to read it. I've been wanting to read this one forever, so I went ahead and read this one physically, and I really, really enjoyed it. This is in the fungal horror category, of which I have read a few now, and of which there seems to be like more and more coming out. This is a retelling beginning of The Fall of the House of Usher, which I read a couple of years ago, partly in anticipation of wanting to read this and partly just to know what it was all about. What Moves the Dead follows that premise loosely with the idea that there is a brother and sister living in kind of a decrepit old mansion, and a friend of theirs comes to visit them, and when he does, he finds out that the sister is sick. The brother isn't looking good either, and this friend of the family, in this book their name is Alex, tries to see what they can do for the brother and sister, these people that they've known for a while, to hopefully make their lives better or to help them in their sickness. And then of course, you know, stuff happens. If you know The Fall of the House of Usher, you know some of the main plot points. If not, you don't. But it's such a short book, definitely worth checking out either way. Especially if you like horror. This has like a little bit of body horror. It has a little bit of like remote location horror. It has a little bit of people you know not being those same people anymore horror. And then obviously fungal horror. I like this one. I thought that it created a really interesting backstory for our main character. Our main character is trans, so you get an interesting idea of their society and how being trans is thought of in that society, and then all the things that they deal with when they're outside of their like homeland. So I thought that was really interesting. I thought there was quite a few characters that you could see coming back. This is a series, so we see quite a few different characters, even though this is kind of like a remote, isolated area. So I really wonder what the next book is like, and there's a third book coming out this year as well. I want to know if the next book is based on some kind of horror as well, or if it's its own story. Like, is our main character going to be kind of shoehorned into different horror stories from the past, or are we now just going to follow this character through normal life within this universe? Either way, I super enjoyed it. I'm super glad that I read it. I love this cover. This will probably make it to my best covers of the year if I had to guess, because it's so beautiful, and I look forward to reading more. The next book that I read in March was Several People Are Typing by Calvin Kasulke. This is a very short book because it's all told in Slack messages. This is a little bit of a weird premise where our main character, Gerald, gets trapped in Slack. So his company that he works for, which is like kind of like a marketing advertising company in a way. They do like different social media accounts and things like that. For some reason, somehow he gets trapped inside Slack and he doesn't know what happens to his body. He doesn't know how to get out, and the only way that he can communicate is through Slack. So the only way that we see communication in this book is through Slack. And so he tries to talk to various people in the office and figure out what's going on. But then we have like side plots as well, where like someone that he's talking to tries to go and find his body, where someone else in the office is seemingly losing their mind, hearing things, where someone else in the office can remember someone that no one else can. So there's a lot of like weird supernatural sort of things going on in this, but all kind of couched in this idea of Slack messages. And it gets like very bizarre. Like sometimes the language gets very bizarre, sometimes the way that the messages are depicted gets bizarre. So it was really interesting. It was super fast, easy to read, and I really enjoyed it. It's queer, which I think is cool. So if you're into something that's like very different, an epistolary novel, which you know I love, but I've definitely never read one like this before, I would definitely suggest checking this one out too. I don't think that it's like a groundbreaking plot, but obviously the device of this novel is why you're reading it. The next book that I finished in March was Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jessie Q. Satanto. I picked this up this year, or late last year, at a book sale. I had not really had intention to read this, except that then I read a short story, one of those short stories by this author, and I really enjoyed it, so I decided to pick it up. Vera Wong is an older Chinese woman living in Chinatown in San Francisco. Her husband has passed away, her son is grown, and he really has a life of his own, and he doesn't really appreciate his mom texting him every morning when she gets up saying like he's lazy and he should be up by now. And we see Vera Wong in this very regimented routine to keep her life going and to keep herself motivated for living. So she gets up early, she goes for a walk, and then she opens her tea house. And one morning when when she's doing this, she finds a dead body in her tea house. She does eventually call the police, but before she calls the police, she does a little bit of investigation of her own, and she does a little preparation of the body, and then she calls the police to come and look into it. Because Vera Wang has watched a lot of cop shows, she's a little disappointed with the cops, and she really thinks that it's up to her to find suspects and figure out how this man died. She's convinced that he was murdered. So we see her doing that, and this kind of gives her life a little bit more adventure and a little bit more purpose than it previously had. And we see her gathering around her a group of people who knew the man that died in her tea shop, and how this group of people become a found family for Vera. And this book was really sweet. It was really cute. It was pretty fast moving. I liked the pacing of how you get to know all the different characters, but it was very, very, very cozy, even though there are some like difficult subject matters like physical and mental abuse of a spouse and depression of people in general, but specifically older people. And then it had some elements of like Vera Wang writes like lists, so we see that a little bit. It had different delves into the different things that the people around her are doing, so we see like what it's like to be a single mom who wishes she was a photographer, and we see what it's like to be an artist with artist block, and we see people from different walks of life coming together and forming this found family. So I really did enjoy it. It was really sweet. I think that you definitely could tell to a certain extent what happened in the mystery, but the mystery definitely took like a big back seat to the character development and the creation of the group of characters that are obviously going to go on and do other adventures and have more cozy mysteries, because this is the first in a series. If you like The Unexpected Mrs. Polifax, if you like We Solve Murders, if you like The Thursday Murder Club and all those books, this is another one to definitely add to that. I think that the immigrant perspective is a really nice touch in this and adds a lot to the character development. A lot of the characters were East Asian or people of color in some variety, so I think that that definitely helped round out the experience of that kind of book. All those other ones that I mentioned are similar for the most part, and definitely they're all pretty white, but this one was nice to have like a juxtaposition, and definitely being set in San Francisco, which is like a larger city, which I haven't seen in some of these septuagenarian or octogenarian mystery books, was an interesting touch as well. So I really enjoyed this one. I definitely plan on continuing on with the series. I don't think it was like groundbreaking, amazing, fantastic, but I really, really enjoyed it and had a super fun time. It was super fun. Oh, and that was the last book that I read in March. So I read a lot of books in March for different readathons. Obviously, for the majority of my reading, a lot of what I read was for March Mystery Madness. I read so many books for March Mystery Madness, but I did also read some books for the Irish readathon. I can't find Small Things Like These, but I read Trespasses and Small Things Like These, and I read Sula and at Bertram's Hotel, which also count because they're green on the cover, which is also part of the prompts for the Irish readathon. I read a book for the Buzz Coverathon, which was a book with books on the cover. I read my TBR Spin book. So overall, I read a ton of books. I read a ton of short stories because I'm trying to get through them. So I read the most books that I've ever read in a month. I read 28 books this month, which is a lot. Like maybe too much. But I'm not worrying about too much or too little reading this year. I'm just reading what I want to read. Let me know if you participated in any of the challenges like the TBR Spin, like the Buzz Coverathon, like the Irish Readathon, like March Mystery Madness that I did, or if you have any others that you participated in March. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here and what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!